We have already introduced you to the HiCone progressive cavity pump. Should it ever be necessary to replace the wear parts, we will show you the required steps today. Before we can start replacing the wear parts, the preparatory activities must first be completed. It is of course important that the pump is switched off and ideally all medium is removed. This means that before we start the actual work, the pump must be drained, all pipelines shut off, and the pump switched off. We begin with the dismantling of the rotor and stator. First, we loosen the 8 screws between the stator and the suction housing, and here at the angled flange of our QuickService principle between the flange and the pipeline. In the next step, we hook the stator onto the 2 lifting eyes with the crane, here using the overhead crane. In practice, if no overhead crane is available, we would of course use a different lifting device to lift the whole unit. This is also helpful for loosening the last screws, which are often harder to loosen due to the weight of the rotor and stator. Now, thanks to our QuickService principle, we lift the rotor and stator sufficiently high enough so that we can reach the nut to disconnect the rotor from the rest of the drivetrain. Here we have the puller tool for the rotor. The thread at the front is screwed into the rotor, and by tightening the screw at the back, which presses against the tie rod, the rotor is detached from the rest of the drivetrain. After the rotor has detached from the rest of the drivetrain, we now remove the rotor-stator-unit. The rotor and stator are now removed. Before installing the new rotor and stator, it is important to first install the new O-ring back into its seat and ensure that it is fully seated in the groove. In the next step, we would now take a new rotor and stator and reassemble them accordingly. This means that all the tasks we just saw are now performed in reverse order. Carefully insert the tie rod through the hollow bore of the rotor and appropriately bring the rotor-stator unit back to its original position. After the new rotor and stator are back in position, we reattach the rotor to the drivetrain with the washer and nut, applying the tightening torque specified in the operating manual to the nut. The rotor is now fixed again. We can now swing everything back and install it. It is very important at this point that the 2 O-ring connections between the suction housing and the stator, as well as here on the side between the stator and the outlet, are in proper condition. This means inserting a new O-ring or checking the existing O-ring. And very importantly, the O-ring must sit properly in its groove to avoid damaging it during assembly. We now lower the rotor and stator back into their original position so that we can reinsert the screws that we removed earlier. The new rotor unit is installed, we are finished and ready for operation.
Vogelsang, leading in technology.